She thought she was just grabbing a random stranger in a dimly lit service hallway of the hotel, hiding from the man who had stood outside her door every week for 18 months, a desperate, impulsive kiss to disappear into the shadows. But when she pulled away, the man wasn't a guest. She had just kissed the one man all of New Orleans only dared to name in a whisper, the architect. If Maeve's journey from an exhausted night shift nurse to the Donna of New Orleans left you breathless, hit that like button so we know you walked every step of it with her. Share this story with the dark romance lovers in your life, and subscribe with the notification bell so you never miss the next one. And would you have chosen the architect? Let us know in the comments. 4 hours before that kiss, Maeve Donnelly was carrying a tray of wine through the grand ballroom of the Beaumont Royale Hotel, and not one of the 300 people in the room could see her. $80 for an extra shift. Her daughter had a follow-up appointment the next week, and $80 was $80. She had worked 12 hours in the emergency department at St. Ambrose, gone home and showered in 10 minutes, then come here wearing a black server's uniform that was too tight around the waist and too loose across the shoulders, with shoes whose worn soles she had repaired twice with glue. The hospital's annual fundraising gala. The sign outside the doors was written in gold lettering. For the future of our young patients. Maeve had read that line 3 times as she passed it, and each time she thought about the stack of red bills lying inside her kitchen drawer, the clink of crystal glasses, collective laughter, the kind that erupted from everyone at once because someone had just made a joke no one had truly heard, the scent of expensive perfume layered over the smell of cold lobster, and among all of it, a 27-year-old woman moved back and forth carrying a tray, and she could have stopped in the middle of the floor, stood perfectly still, closed her eyes, and not one person would have asked whether she was all right. She had tested it. Once, 2 months earlier, during another banquet shift, she had tried. She stood motionless for 30 seconds. No one looked. It wasn't humiliation. Humiliation at least meant that people saw you. This was something else, thinner and colder. She was a serving stand with legs, something people reached toward, took a glass of wine from, then returned to their unfinished conversation without losing the rhythm of a single word. Maeve shifted the tray to her left hand. On her left wrist was a faded white burn scar shaped like a crescent, and she had learned to turn her hand so that her sleeve concealed it. A habit of 18 years, she slipped past a group of guests standing near the podium and saw him, Dr. Alistair Vance, chairman of the hospital board. 60 years old, silver hair combed neatly, wearing a gray suit whose waistcoat alone cost half a month of her salary. 3 years earlier, he had personally signed her employment papers. Maeve still remembered that document. She had kept it in a drawer for an entire year like a talisman, proof that an orphan raised inside the foster care system could become someone useful. She nodded in greeting, only a small, respectful nod, the nod of an employee toward the man who stood at the head of the place where she worked. Vance looked at her, his eyes touched her face, and for one brief fraction of a second, something passed through them. It wasn't failure to recognize her, quite the opposite. Then he turned away, without hesitation, without awkwardness. He simply turned toward the person beside him and continued the conversation where it had left off, as though the place where Maeve stood had always been empty air. She felt heat rise into her cheeks, and she hated herself for it. He was chairman of the board. He signed hundreds of papers. He didn't remember who she was, and why should he? She continued walking, and that was when she saw Kurt Halloran. He stood alone near the bar, holding a glass of orange juice, wearing a shiny blue suit that didn't fit his shoulders. 40 years old, red-faced, gold rings on his fingers, carrying the scent of menthol cigarettes that Maeve could smell from 10 feet away because she had smelled it every Friday night for 18 months. He didn't belong there. His name wasn't on the guest list. He didn't have the money to buy a ticket, and he didn't know a single person in that room. And that was the entire message. The tray in Maeve's hands tilted. A glass of wine spilled and soaked into the carpet, and she didn't even look down. Kurt approached. He didn't touch her. He had never touched her, and that was what made him different from other men and what made him worse than all of them. He only tilted his head, close enough that she could hear him swallow, and spoke in the intimate tone of a cousin offering advice. Beautiful, isn't it, sweetheart? This ballroom. All these lights. He looked around and nodded appreciatively. I have a friend at the State Board of Nursing, a very decent man. All I have to do is say one thing. One thing about medication going missing from the emergency department cabinet, and they'll open an investigation. Do you know how long an investigation lasts, sweetheart? 9 months. 9 months when you aren't allowed to touch a patient. He smiled. Then what will you use to pay? Maeve said nothing. She bent down and placed the tray on the nearest table covered in white linen, straight and careful, as though it were the most important thing in the world. Then she turned and walked away. She walked in a straight line, not quickly, through the crowd, through the collective laughter, past the gold-lettered sign speaking of the future of young patients, and pushed open the service door at the far end of the ballroom. The heavy door closed behind her, and the music vanished. The service corridor was long and narrow, with a low ceiling and yellow lights spaced exactly 16 feet apart, and between every two lights lay a stretch of darkness. The sharp smell of lemon disinfectant rose from the tiled floor, a scent Maeve knew better than the perfume in the ballroom, because it was the smell of places where guests were never invited. She had taken 10 steps when she heard it. The heavy door behind her opened, then closed, and footsteps. Not fast. That was the worst part. Kurt Halloran never ran because he didn't need to. The soles of his shoes tapped against the tile slowly, steadily, leisurely, as a man strolling through a park, and that rhythm told Maeve exactly what he wanted it to tell her. She had nowhere to go, and they both knew it. She quickened her pace. There were no doors, no restroom, no turn, only a straight corridor leading toward the private suites at the far end, and a small alcove halfway down, about 3 feet deep and dark. Maeve. Kurt's voice traveled along the corridor, warm, almost affectionate. Don't be childish. She looked ahead. At the end of the hallway was a door, and she didn't know whether it was locked, and if it was, she would be standing there with her back against the wood while he approached slowly, and she would have to watch him savor every step. She looked toward the alcove, and only then did she realize that a man was standing inside its darkness with his back to her, completely silent. He was straightening a painting that hung crooked on the wall. Kurt's shadow had already stretched across the floor behind her. Perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 2. And Maeve Donnelly, the woman who had spent 18 months making herself as small as possible, did the most reckless thing she had ever done. She rushed into the alcove, seized the stranger by his lapels, turned him around, and pressed her lips to his. She had prepared herself for a shout, for a shove, for disgust. Instead, a hand in a leather glove settled around her waist. It didn't push her away. It pulled her closer. His other hand pressed against her back, broad and firm, and the man tilted his head and took control of the kiss as though he had been standing there waiting for it from the beginning of the evening. He tasted of whiskey and bitter orange. Something hot and sharp traveled down Maeve's spine, a sensation whose name she had forgotten long ago, and during those 3 seconds, she completely forgot why she was there. The footsteps passed. They slowed for 1 beat at the mouth of the alcove. Then Kurt muttered a curse meant for some drunken couple and continued walking. The footsteps faded. Maeve tore herself away, gasping. Her heart was beating so violently that she could hear it inside her ears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She spoke into the front of his jacket, unable to raise her eyes, her gaze fixed on the only detail within sight, a silver cufflink shaped like a compass. There was a man. He was following me. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. The man said nothing. Maeve slowly lifted her head. The face looking down at her seemed carved from stone by a craftsman who made only beautiful and dangerous things. Sharp cheekbones, a hard jaw, black hair combed back, and the eyes. They were pale, amber, the kind of color a person saw once and remembered forever, and they were watching her without blinking. He wasn't angry. He looked amused, and something radiated from him, a thick, absolute stillness. The silence of a room just before something very terrible happened. Is that so? His voice was so quiet that Maeve had to hold her breath to hear it. Then she heard another sound. 6 safety catches being released almost simultaneously. The blood drained from her face. From the darkness of the adjoining suite, 6 men in black suits stepped forward. No one hurried. No one spoke. And all 6 suppressed pistols were aimed at her head. Want me to clear her, boss? The man who spoke was about 45, with weathered skin and a lazy drawl, asking in the tone of someone wondering whether another piece of ice was needed in a drink. Maeve stopped breathing. She looked again at the man she had just kissed. Boss. And then the name fell into place. The name she had heard 2 senior physicians whisper inside an elevator 6 months earlier before falling silent when they noticed her. Rafael Santoro. The architect. People didn't say he killed anyone. They said he spent 6 months constructing the day when a person lost everything, then stood and watched it happen. The harbor, customs, judges, half of this city breathed through his lungs, and she had just grabbed his lapels and used him as a shield. Raphael raised his gloved hand. Only one small, almost lazy gesture. The 6 pistols lowered and disappeared into shoulder holsters with military precision. He looked down at her. His gaze traveled slowly from her face downward, across the cheap serving uniform, her shoulders, her waist, then returned to her face. And this was what Maeve couldn't understand, the thing that would keep her awake until morning. Kurt looked at her as though she were a debt. This entire city looked at her as though she were a shadow passing through. Rafael Santoro looked at her as though she were real. Stand down. Gideon. His voice remained quiet, his eyes never leaving her. The lady is only hiding. I have to go. Maeve heard her own voice breaking into pieces. She pulled herself free of his hands. Raphael allowed her to leave, his arms lowering leisurely to his sides. She ran. She ran down the corridor, past the yellow lights, shoved through the heavy door, and plunged back into the music and laughter, and 300 people, none of whom could see her, and she didn't look back. Had she looked back, she would have seen Rafael Santoro bend down and pick up what had fallen from her pocket during the struggle. A hard plastic employee identification card, worn at the corners. He turned it over in his hand. Read the name. Maeve Donnelly, nurse, emergency department. Then he looked at the logo printed in the upper left corner. St. Ambrose Hospital. Rafael Santoro stood perfectly still inside the dark alcove beneath the painting he had just straightened. Then, slowly, he removed the leather glove from his left hand. 4 nights passed. 4 nights of Maeve locking the door twice, checking it again, then lying in bed and checking it once more inside her mind. 4 nights of jolting awake at the sound of pipes inside the walls. She developed a new habit. Never looking at any black SUV parked along the street, because looking meant admitting there might be one waiting for her. And if she didn't look, perhaps it didn't exist. She told herself she was being paranoid. Rafael Santoro was a billionaire. He owned the port of New Orleans. He didn't spend his time thinking about a tray-carrying nurse who had pinned him against a wall for 5 seconds and then run away. To a man like him, she was merely a strange thing that had happened on a Saturday night, a story he might tell once and then forget. Nothing more. But the relief of having survived that night wasn't enough to hide a much simpler truth. Her life remained exactly the same. 12-hour shifts in the emergency department. A man arriving at 11 o'clock at night with chest pain. A teenage boy whose hand had been cut by a broken bottle. An elderly woman who had fallen in the bathroom and kept apologizing for troubling everyone. Maeve was good at this. It was the only thing in the world she knew for certain about herself. Her hands were steady. Her mind remained cool. And when everything fell apart, she was the only person in the room who didn't tremble. Then at 3 o'clock in the morning, she returned to her second-floor apartment in mid-city, opened the door as quietly as possible, removed her shoes in the darkness, and stood in the kitchen, looking at the stack of papers inside the drawer. There was a color system. Blue meant a new bill, yellow meant the first reminder, red meant the account had been sent to collections. Her kitchen drawer currently held 3 blue notices, 2 yellow ones, and 4 red ones. She had learned that if she placed the red papers at the bottom, she would see only blue whenever she opened the drawer. It was the only trick she had left. The nebulizer on top of the refrigerator had been making a faint rattling sound since the previous month, and its plastic casing had developed a crack along one side. Maeve had sealed it with black electrical tape, 3 careful layers, as though closing a wound with stitches. It still worked. A $400 machine she was keeping alive with $1 tape, and she was a nurse, and she knew exactly what that meant. But the following morning, there was sunlight. It passed through the old yellow kitchen curtain and fell in a long band across the table. And inside that strip of light, Noelle Donnelly, 4 years old, her red hair wildly tangled, was hosting a tea party. Her only guest was a faded gray stuffed elephant named Bread. "You're doing it wrong, Mommy," the little girl said with great seriousness. Maeve, holding a pink plastic teacup, stopped. "What am I doing wrong?" "You're tipping it too much." Noelle placed one hand on the table like a professor preparing to deliver the most important lecture of her career. "Bread has a trunk, a very long trunk. If you tip it too much, the tea runs down too fast and she chokes." "Oh, you only tip it a little." The child took her mother's hand, adjusted Maeve's wrist to exactly 30 degrees, then nodded with satisfaction. "There, slowly. Now she can drink." Then she turned toward the elephant and whispered soothingly, "Sorry, my mommy is still learning." And Maeve Donnelly laughed. Not the polite laugh she used at the hospital, a real laugh, rising from somewhere inside her chest, laughter strong enough that she had to set down the plastic cup, and for those 3 seconds she didn't think about the kitchen drawer, didn't think about the electrical tape, didn't think about footsteps on the stairs on Friday nights. 3 seconds. Then she looked at the clock and saw that it was 7:15, and she had to take the little girl to the neighbor's apartment and reach the hospital by 8 o'clock. At 4 o'clock the following morning, inside the third-floor nurse's lounge, fluorescent light, the smell of burned coffee. Maeve sat in a plastic chair with both hands wrapped around a cup, and she had no idea how long she had been sitting that way. Sister Agnes Bellwether placed a second cup on the table in front of her. 61 years old, head nurse on the night shift, 30 years in nursing, and 12 years before that inside a convent she never spoke about. She sat down, slipped off her shoes, and sighed. You accepted another Tuesday evening shift. I need the money. You accepted Tuesday evening, Wednesday night, the extra hotel shift on Saturday, and last week you worked the entire weekend. Agnes didn't look at her. She stared directly at the wall. Do you know how many years I've done this work? I've seen every kind of exhaustion. I know its face. Maeve looked down into the coffee. I'm fine. You aren't fine. The older woman turned toward her, and her eyes were very gentle, which was precisely why the next sentence hurt so much. You aren't living, Maeve. You're paying for permission to exist. Maeve opened her mouth to argue. Then she closed it again. Because beyond the window, dawn hadn't arrived yet, and that day was Friday. At 9 o'clock that night, Maeve switched off every light in the apartment and sat in the armchair beside the window. Noelle had been asleep since 8:30, her bedroom door left slightly open, the elephant-shaped nightlight casting a weak circle of orange light onto the hallway wall. Maeve sat with her back straight and both hands resting on her knees, and waited. She had sat exactly that way for 78 consecutive Friday nights, and she knew the order of every sound that was supposed to come. First, the door in the lobby, its hinge squealing across half an octave, then 7 seconds of silence while he lit a cigarette at the foot of the stairs, and the smell of peppermint would crawl upward before he did. Then 11 steps, and he always came down heavily on the fourth, the loose one. Then 3 knocks on the door, spaced perfectly evenly, never hurried, because he had never needed to hurry. 9:10. Nothing. The refrigerator started, then stopped. In the apartment next door, someone was watching a game, the commentator's voice coming through the wall like speech underwater. 9:30. Maeve didn't move. She watched the digital clock on the microwave change numbers, change again, and she began to feel something she had no name for. 9:45. She stood, walked to the door, and pressed her ear against the wood. The staircase was silent. She returned to the chair, sat down, placed her hands on her knees. 10 o'clock. He didn't come. And in the darkness of that kitchen, Maeve Donnelly realized something terrible about herself, something that made her stomach knot. She wasn't relieved. She was panicking. For 78 weeks, Kurt Halloran's cruelty had at least followed a schedule. He arrived at 9 o'clock, said 5 minutes, then left. She had arranged her entire life around 9 o'clock on Friday nights, the way people arranged their lives around a chronic illness. Horrible, but familiar, named, measurable. She had known exactly how many minutes her fear lasted, and now it was gone. That absence didn't mean she was free. It meant someone, on a level above her head, in a place she wasn't permitted to see, had reached down and moved something inside her life, and no one had asked her permission. 10:20, 10:50. Maeve remained in the darkness, and she realized her hands were cold. 11:04. Her telephone vibrated on the table, lighting a pale blue square inside the dark room, and Maeve flinched. An unfamiliar number. No name. She stared at it for 3 seconds before touching the screen. The message contained only 8 words. The gentleman is otherwise occupied this evening. R.S. Maeve placed the telephone down very slowly, screen against the tabletop, as though it might explode if she handled it too roughly. She sat motionless. Outside the window, a vehicle passed, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling before disappearing, and she understood that this wasn't relief. It was an entirely new kind of fear, pure and bright, and sharp as a newly unwrapped scalpel, because for 18 months, she had believed the thing tightening around her throat was the heaviest, worst, most immovable thing in the world. She had built her entire identity around enduring it. Then a man had reached through it, brushed it aside like a branch blocking a path, without breaking a sweat, without offering a single explanation, and sent her 8 words so she would know it had been moved. He hadn't asked whether she wanted it. He had simply done it. Maeve sat in the darkness until nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and the only thought she could form was this: if someone could do that so easily, then he could do the opposite just as easily. At 6:15 the following morning, inside the third-floor employee changing room at St. Ambrose Hospital, the smell of industrial soap and paper towels. In one corner, a hand dryer roared. Maeve turned the combination lock on her locker, pulled open the metal door, and froze. Inside, resting neatly on top of her folded lab coats, was a box. No brand name on the outside, no wrapping paper, no tape. It simply sat there, square and precise, as though it had always belonged in that place. This locker was locked. This locker stood behind 2 magnetic access doors inside an employee-only area on the 3rd floor of a hospital with 40 cameras. Maeve looked around the room. No one was paying attention to her. No one ever paid attention to her. She lifted the lid. Inside was a nebulizer. A quiet model with dual filters and a flow meter, the kind she had stood looking at through the window of a medical equipment store on Canal Street in March, standing there long enough for the salesman to come outside and ask whether she needed help, and she had said no, thank you, I'm only looking, then walked away. It cost more than 1 month of her rent. Still sealed. Resting on top was a thick white card, handwritten in black ink, the strokes slanted and sharp, as though carved with a knife. The painting is still crooked, but you are not R.S. Maeve read it 3 times. Then she sat on the wooden bench between the 2 rows of lockers with the box in her lap, and she remained there for a very long time while her shift began without her, because she had just understood something. That man hadn't given her a gift. He had shown her how far his reach extended. It took Maeve 2 days and 4 telephone calls to find the address, and the last person who gave it to her was a resident physician who had just finished his shift, a man who looked both ways down the corridor before speaking, and then told her never to mention that the information had come from him. On Monday afternoon, after her shift ended, still wearing her nursing scrubs beneath a thin coat, the box wedged under one arm like a stubborn child, she stepped out of a taxi before a black iron gate in the Garden District. Ancient oak trees lowered curtains of moss toward the street. There was no nameplate, no house number. Maeve raised her hand in search of a bell. The gate slid open before her finger touched anything. No voice, no person. It simply opened without a sound, as though the house had known she was coming before she knew it herself, and the thought raised the hair along the back of her neck. A stone path led through a garden unlike any she had ever seen. Nothing was ostentatious. No statues, no fountains. Only trees arranged in lines so perfectly straight that they were almost frightening. The scent of damp earth and the sound of late-season cicadas. In the center of the garden, beneath the slanting sunlight of 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man was watering an orange tree. Rafael Santoro wasn't wearing a suit. His white shirt was rolled to the elbows, his left hand still covered by the black leather glove, his right holding a brass watering can dulled by age. The man who owned the Port of New Orleans was watering a tree, and he was doing it carefully, pouring around the roots rather than directly against the trunk, waiting for the water to sink into the soil before adding more. Maeve walked toward him and set the box on the stone table harder than she intended. The dry sound echoed through the garden. "I can't sell it." Her voice trembled, but she realized with some surprise that it was trembling from anger rather than fear. "There's no receipt, no registered serial number. I took it to a medical equipment store, and they asked where I got it, and I couldn't answer. I can't give it to anyone either, because I can't look at it without thinking of you, and I can't use it, because every time I switch it on, I'll have to remember that someone opened my locker inside a hospital with 40 cameras and no one saw a thing." She drew a breath. "So what do you want?" Raphael set down the watering can. He turned toward her leisurely, and those amber eyes looked at her in the exact way that had kept her awake, the way of a man looking at something real standing before him. "For 34 years, he said, so quietly that she had to step half a pace closer to hear. "Everyone has come to me offering one thing in exchange for another. Money for silence, loyalty for protection. One man offered me his own daughter in exchange for a name on the city council." He tilted his head. "Everyone comes with both hands extended, Miss Donnelly. You are the first person in 34 years to take something from me without asking permission. I already apologized." "I'm not asking for an apology." "Then what are you asking for?" Raphael didn't answer immediately. He reached for a thin file lying face down on the stone table, something that had already been waiting there before she arrived. And that was the detail Maeve would remember later. He pushed it toward her with 2 fingers of his gloved hand. $340,000, he said. That's the number you've been carrying on your back, isn't it? Maeve didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her entire body had frozen. The O'Doherty family keeps 3 sets of books. One for the police, one for the tax authorities, and one that tells the truth. I don't care about the first 2. He tapped one finger lightly against the file. The most recent 3 years. Every transaction. Every name. He paused for exactly 1 beat, and that beat lasted an entire lifetime. There is no Brody Vaughn. No loan, no debt. Not one entry bearing your husband's name anywhere. He looked directly into her eyes. Miss Donnelly, you don't owe them a single cent. You never did. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere far away, a bird called. The scent of damp earth and orange peel. Maeve heard her heart beat 3 times before she could speak, and when her voice emerged, it was thin as paper. Then, she swallowed. Then what were the last 18 months? She thought of the kitchen drawer and the red papers. She thought of $340,000. The number that had stood between her and everything else. The number she had calculated again and again at 4 o'clock in the morning. 38 years if she paid $1,000 a month. 38 years. Her daughter would be 42 by the time the debt was gone. She thought of every Friday night. She had paid that number with her life. And it had never existed. That is precisely the question that has kept me awake for 4 nights. And for the first time, something changed in Rafael Santoro's face. It wasn't pity. Maeve had lived with pity all her life, and she could recognize it from a distance. This was something much sharper. It was the irritation of a man staring at a crooked painting he couldn't reach. I can buy anything in this city, he said. I can buy federal judges. I can buy the result of an election if it inconveniences me. But I can't buy the answer to why someone would spend 18 months standing outside your door every week at exactly 9 o'clock, so precisely that you could set your watch by him, without taking a single cent from you. He stepped closer. People don't do that, Miss Donnelly. People collect debts to obtain money. If they don't want money, then they want something else. I have spent 4 nights trying to discover what that something is, and I haven't found it. That has never happened to me before. Maeve looked at the file. She looked at the gloved hand resting upon it. And she saw Brody. She saw him 3 years earlier, sitting on the edge of the bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, his eyes blazing, holding her hand and telling her he would take care of everything, that she shouldn't worry, that he had a way, that she mustn't ask questions, that she only needed to trust him, and she had trusted him. 18 months later, he died on a stretch of highway at 4 o'clock in the morning and left her a hell she had just discovered had never existed. The price of not asking questions had been 18 months of her life. No, she said. Raphael remained still. You're going to tell me that you can take care of this, that I only have to stand back, let you handle it, and ask no questions. She stepped backward. I've heard those exact words before, from a man I loved. And he died, and the price of his choices fell on me, and I paid it for 18 months with the only thing I had. She pushed the box toward him. Thank you for the machine. I'll repay you every month if you give me an account number. But I don't want you to protect me, Mr. Santoro. I don't want to owe you. I've only just learned that I don't owe anyone anything, and I would like to keep that feeling for 1 more day before the next man takes it away. Rafael Santoro didn't stop her. He didn't say a word. He only watched her turn, follow the stone path back through the garden, pass through the iron gate that remained open, and walk into the street, and those amber eyes never blinked once. Gideon Price stepped out from the veranda, holding a cup of coffee in one hand, and stood beside his employer for a long time, looking toward the gate. Boss, he finally said, who is she to you? Raphael reached inside his breast pocket. He removed something and handed it to Gideon without looking at him. A hard plastic hospital employee identification card, worn at the corners. Gideon turned it over, read the name, then his eyes moved toward the upper left corner, toward the 3 words printed there, and Gideon Price, who had followed this man for 11 years, fell silent. He returned the card. Raphael slipped it carefully into his breast pocket, picked up the watering can, and turned back toward his orange tree. That, he said, is the question I've been asking myself. Maeve Donnelly had said no, and Rafael Santoro had allowed her to leave, and both of those things were true. But there was one thing Maeve didn't understand about that man. He didn't hear refusal as an answer. He heard it as information. She didn't want to owe him. Fine. Then he would remove that debt from her life without her ever knowing, and she would owe no one anything, and that was precisely what she had asked for. Raphael told himself that, and it was the first time in many years that he lied to himself. On Wednesday morning, the Golden Horseshoe Bar in the Irish Channel opened at 11 o'clock, and Gideon Price walked inside at 11:02. The bar was dark, smelling of stale beer and wet wood, with a television mounted in one corner showing horse racing no one was watching. Connor O'Doherty sat at the last table beneath a yellow lamp, 52 years old, wearing a gray sweater, reading glasses low on his nose, studying a printed newspaper. He looked like a grandfather waiting for his grandchild to finish school. That was what made him the most dangerous man in the neighborhood. Gideon placed an aluminum case on the table without speaking and sat down. Connor didn't look at the case. He folded the newspaper carefully along its existing creases. Then he reached for a pot of hot tea that had already been placed on the table, took a second cup, and poured for Gideon, before pouring for himself. "How is your mother these days, Gideon?" Gideon remained silent for 2 seconds. "She's well. Her hip still hurts. At her age, everyone's hip hurts." Connor pushed the cup toward him. "Does she still make cornbread?" "When I was 30, I used to cross the bridge for 40 minutes, just to buy a loaf from her. Don't tell anyone. I'll tell her you asked about her. Please do." Gideon took a sip of tea. It was good. That was the part that bothered him most. Then he placed one hand on the case and opened it. $1 million, arranged in 12 perfectly even stacks, the faces of the bills turned upward. 3 times the amount of $340,000, 3 times a debt both men at that table knew didn't exist. "The architect sends his regards," Gideon said. "He says this: whatever the matter concerning Miss Donnelly may be, it ends today. This is 3 times the amount. He isn't asking why. He doesn't want to know. He only wants it finished." Connor O'Doherty looked inside the case. He looked for a very long time, and Gideon saw something he would report later and remember forever. The old man didn't look at the money like someone being tempted. He looked at it like a man staring at something he wanted very badly but knew he wasn't permitted to touch, and there was something almost like regret in his eyes. Then Connor placed 2 fingers on the lid and pushed it closed. The cup in Gideon's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. Connor slid the case gently back across the table until it touched Gideon's elbow. "Tell the architect that I'm very fond of him," the old man said, and his voice was warm, and he seemed sincere. "Tell him I've been fond of him since he was 19 and did that thing at Pier 7 no one believed he could do." He removed his reading glasses, wiped them with the hem of his sweater, and put them back on. "And tell him the girl isn't for sale." Gideon lowered his cup. "Mr. O'Doherty, she was never for sale, son." Connor reopened the newspaper and found the place where he had stopped reading. "Finish your tea. The day is still young." 3 hours later, in the basement of the Garden District mansion. No windows, a desk lamp, a metal table. Rafael Santoro listened to the recording from beginning to end without saying a word. Then he pressed the button and listened a second time. By the third, Gideon had begun to feel uneasy. When the recording ended, the room was so silent they could hear the computer fan. Rafael stood with both hands braced against the edge of the metal table, his head lowered, and Gideon realized he was witnessing something that had never happened in the 11 years he had followed this man. Rafael Santoro had bought a port. He had bought 3 federal judges, a city councilman, and a police commissioner whose name no one knew. He had bought the silence of people who had every reason not to remain silent. During Gideon's 2nd year, Rafael had told him one thing: everything has a price. Only fools believe the price is money, but everyone has a number, and he had just offered 3 times the number for a debt that didn't exist, and an old man in a sweater had pushed it back and poured Rafael's man a cup of tea. "He doesn't want money, boss," Gideon said. "He wants her." Rafael didn't raise his head. No, his voice was so quiet that Gideon had to lean closer. If he wanted her, he would have taken her 18 months ago. He had a man standing beneath her window every week. He could have taken her on any Friday night, and no one in this city would have lifted a finger. Rafael straightened. No, he didn't take her. He didn't take her money. He sent someone there only to stand and watch. He turned, and his eyes shone in a way that made Gideon step back half a pace without realizing it. He wants something inside her, Gideon. Something she's carrying, and he doesn't know where it is, so he doesn't dare touch her. He only dares watch. He paused, and she doesn't know she's carrying it. Gideon opened his mouth, then closed it, because he had understood the next sentence before Rafael spoke it. "Which means," Rafael said, "as long as he hasn't found it, she remains alive." Silence. and the day he finds it, she dies. Rafael Santoro pulled out the chair and sat down. Then, slowly, he removed the leather glove from his left hand. Gideon turned his face away, not from disgust, but because in 11 years he had seen this only 3 times, and all 3 times someone had died afterward. Rafael Santoro's left hand had 4 fingers. Where his little finger should have been was an old white scar, cleanly healed, 23 years old. He placed that hand on the cold metal table and stared at it for a long time, as though looking at something that belonged to someone else. Then he put the glove back on, 1 finger at a time. Gideon. Yes, boss. Beginning tonight, I want someone beneath her window. 2 shifts. Our best people. He stood and fastened the silver compass cuff link again. And Gideon. Don't let her see them. Gideon stopped at the door. Boss. She said she didn't want this. I know what she said. Raphael switched off the desk lamp. She said she doesn't want to owe anyone, so she'll never know. At 2 o'clock on Thursday morning, Maeve slid her key into the apartment lock, and her entire body felt so heavy that she had to lean one shoulder against the doorframe. 12 hours in the emergency department. A 3-vehicle collision on Interstate 10 had come in at 10 o'clock that night, and she hadn't sat down once. The apartment was empty tonight, and she had told herself she should be grateful for that. Noelle was sleeping at Sister Agnes's home, where there were butter cookies in a tin and an elephant-shaped nightlight the older woman had bought at a flea market, simply because the little girl had looked at it for 2 seconds. And in the morning, the 2 of them would eat fried eggs before Maeve came to collect her. She pushed the door open, dropped her bag, and reached for the light switch. Don't turn it on. Maeve froze. The voice came from the armchair beside the window, her own chair, and she recognized the smell before she recognized the voice. Menthol cigarettes. Sit down, sweetheart. Kurt Halloran was sitting in the darkness, and something about his posture was wrong. For 18 months, he had always stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, leisurely, savoring it. Tonight he was hunched forward, both elbows resting on his knees, and when the streetlight swept across his face, Maeve saw that his clothes were wrinkled and his collar was dirty. Today isn't Friday, she said. Kurt released a dry laugh. No, it isn't Friday. He looked around the apartment as though seeing it for the first time. You know, I stood outside that door for 18 months, 78 times. I know the 4th stair is loose. I know the hinge downstairs squeals when the weather is damp. I know you leave the kitchen light on until 11 o'clock. He looked up. Did I ever ask you for money? Even once. A single cent. Maeve didn't answer. Her whole body had gone cold. Because she had asked that question. She had asked it in the orange garden, and a man wearing leather gloves had told her he couldn't find the answer. The old man forbade me, Kurt said. His voice broke in the middle of the sentence, and that was the most frightening part, because he wasn't angry. He was confused. Forbade me, sweetheart. Connor O'Doherty looked me straight in the face and said, Curtis, you stand there. You don't take 1 cent from the girl. You don't touch her, and you report back to me every week. Do you understand how insane that is? I'm a debt collector. My job is to take money. That is my entire job. He spread both hands, pleading with her to understand. I had to stand there. I had to count. Who you met. Who you called. What time you came home. Who you came with. Whether anyone went up the stairs. For 18 months, I stood outside your door, and I had no idea what the hell I was doing there. He rose. And do you know what he did last week? He cut me off. Not 1 word, not 1 cent. Threw me away like a broken chair after 3 years. Maeve backed toward the door. Leave. I need something. Leave, Kurt. I need something I can sell, sweetheart. And he pulled a knife from his coat pocket. Not to stab her. Maeve recognized that immediately because she was an emergency nurse and had seen dozens of people holding knives with the intention to stab, and they held them differently. He held it like a pair of scissors. His eyes weren't fixed on her stomach. They were fixed on her neck. The necklace. Maeve's hand flew to her chest before she could think. The thin silver chain lay beneath her blouse, warm from her body, something she had worn every day for 3 years and had forgotten she was wearing. No, the old man made me record it, every week. Whether you were wearing it, whether you ever took it off. Kurt stepped closer. For 3 years, I didn't understand why, but if the old man made me count that cheap little thing 78 times, it has to be worth something to someone, and I need something valuable, sweetheart, right now. The door exploded inward. 3 beats. That was all Maeve remembered afterward. Beat 1. A figure crossed the room faster than should have been possible, and Kurt's knife hand was wrenched upward with one short sound. Beat 2. The dining table split in half when both bodies crashed onto it. Beat 3. A gasp, and then silence. Gideon Price stood first. Kurt didn't. The necklace lay broken on the wooden floor beside a piece of the shattered table. Maeve saw the dark stain spreading across Gideon's shoulder, and her entire body shifted into the mode it had entered every night for 6 years. Sit down. Take off your jacket. She had already crossed the room, found a clean towel, and pressed her palm against the wound, her hand steady, her mind cold. It isn't deep. You're lucky. 3 inches farther over, and it would have damaged the joint. Gideon looked down at the woman kneeling beside him, the woman who had been held at knife point 10 seconds earlier, and he said nothing. And that was when Rafael Santoro stepped through the doorway. He didn't look at Kurt Halloran lying on the floor. He didn't look at the broken table, the knife, or Gideon bleeding. He walked straight past all of it, bent down, and picked up the necklace. Maeve looked up, one hand still pressing against Gideon's shoulder. That belongs to me. Rafael didn't answer. He raised the chain beneath the streetlight coming through the window, a silver pendant shaped like a teardrop, worn and tarnished. It had cost $40 at a stall in the French market. Brody had given it to her on their wedding day because he couldn't afford a ring, and he had apologized throughout the entire evening, and she had told him to be quiet. She liked it. It was the only thing belonging to Brody Vaughn that she had kept. Raphael turned it slowly between his gloved fingers. Once, twice. Then he stopped. He brought it closer to his eyes, and Maeve saw his shoulders change position, the way a person changed when they had just noticed a crooked painting. A groove ran around the edge of the pendant, thin as a strand of hair, something anyone would mistake for the seam of a cheap mold. Raphael pulled off his right glove with his teeth. He pressed his thumbnail into the groove and twisted. It opened. The pendant separated into 2 halves like a shell, and inside, fitted into a hollow carved with precision down to 1/10 of a millimeter, was a black micro SD card. The room became absolutely silent. Maeve could hear blood pounding inside her ears. 18 months, 78 Friday nights, a criminal organization refusing $1 million, and pouring tea for the messenger. An old man forbidding his men to take even 1 cent from her, and ordering one of them to stand outside her door and count whether she was wearing it. The thing the entire city had been searching for over 18 months had hung around her neck beneath her nursing blouse, warm with her body, every night, every shift, every time she bent over a bleeding stranger on a stretcher. Rafael Santoro looked up. Those amber eyes met hers, and for the first time since the alcove at the Beaumont Royale Hotel, Maeve saw something inside them that looked very much like fear. "Miss Donnelly," he said very quietly, "what did your husband leave you?" Maeve didn't answer that question because she had no answer. She sat on the floor with one hand still pressed against Gideon Price's shoulder, staring at the memory card in Rafael Santoro's bare palm as though it were an object from another planet. She had worn it for 3 years. She had worn it when Brody was taken to the morgue. She had worn it in court while signing the papers. She had worn it through 78 Friday nights, while a man stood outside her door, counting whether it was still around her neck. On the floor, about 10 feet away, Kurt Halloran moved. He rolled onto his side, clutching his wrist, and when he saw who was standing inside the apartment, everything within him collapsed at once. He didn't beg. That was the strange part. He only lay still and began breathing quickly and shallowly, the way an animal breathed when it already knew, and Maeve realized he was waiting. Gideon pushed her hand away and rose on his own, one hand holding his shoulder. He looked down at Kurt. "Boss, take care of him." His voice was frighteningly ordinary, the voice of someone suggesting that a spilled puddle be cleaned up. "No. He just saw what you're holding," Gideon said. "He knows the necklace. He knows the old man ordered him to watch it. He'll put those 2 things together in the car before he's even out of this neighborhood, and he'll sell us to anyone willing to pay." "I know. Then why?" Raphael didn't answer him. He closed the pendant carefully and placed it inside his breast pocket beside the employee identification card. Then he crossed the room and lowered himself, one knee touching the floor, until he was level with the man lying there. He spoke so quietly that Maeve, sitting 10 feet away, had to hold her breath to hear him. "I'm not going to kill you, Kurt." Kurt Halloran blinked. "I'm going to let you walk out that door. You'll be able to leave. No one will stop you on the stairs." Raphael tilted his head. "Then you'll return to your neighborhood, and people will ask what happened to your hand, and you'll tell them. Perhaps you'll lie the first time, but you'll drink, and you'll tell it again, and by the fourth telling, the entire neighborhood will know." He paused for exactly one beat. "They'll know that Curtis Halloran stood outside a woman's door for 18 months, 78 weeks, that the thing he was sent to find hung around her neck the entire time, 18 inches from his face every Friday night, and he never saw it. The old man didn't cut him loose because the work was finished. The old man cut him loose because he was useless." Kurt began to tremble. "That is what I need you to do." Raphael stood and brushed off his knee. "Death takes only a second, Kurt. People pity a dead man. They don't pity a failure. Humiliation lasts for years, and you'll have to live inside it. And every time you enter a bar, it will already be there waiting for you." Kurt Halloran crawled out of the apartment. He couldn't stand when he reached the doorway, so he crawled across it, and they heard him drag himself down 11 steps, and the fourth stair cried out exactly as it had throughout those 18 months. Then the lobby door squealed through half an octave and closed. Gideon stared at the empty doorway for a long time. "Boss, yes, you just released a starving dog into the street." Rafael Santoro had already turned away and was looking at the dining table broken in half. "A starving dog returns to its former master, Gideon. It will crawl back to Connor O'Doherty's door and whine, and the old man will kick it again, and that will be the old man's problem." He said it with the complete certainty of someone who had never been wrong. Gideon said nothing more. He only looked at his employer, and something passed across his face before disappearing. Much later, long after everything had burned, Gideon Price would remember that exact moment and wonder why he hadn't argued one more time. Rafael Santoro would remember standing inside that apartment among the broken pieces of wood and believing he had just designed something beautiful. Neither man knew that the starving dog wouldn't return to its former master. It would find a new one. "Take him down to the car," Rafael said. "Call Dr. Cormier. That shoulder needs stitches." "Yes, boss." Gideon left. 2 people remained inside the dark room. Maeve rose from the floor. Her legs trembled, and she hated them for it. She looked at her table, the table where her daughter had poured tea for a stuffed elephant on Tuesday morning, now split in half. She looked at the blood on her handkerchief, then she looked at the man standing in the middle of her apartment as though he belonged there. "Give me back the necklace." Raphael turned. "Miss Donnelly, give me back the necklace." He didn't move. And Maeve heard her voice rising, shaking, and she didn't restrain it. "I wore it for 3 years. 3 years. I wore it when I signed the papers to claim my husband's body. I wore it when I sat in the car in the parking lot and couldn't make myself stand up. It is the only thing I have left of him, and it cost $40, and I know it cost $40. She drew a breath. "You just took it from my neck, inside my home. You didn't ask me a single question. You didn't tell me what you were looking for. You simply bent down, picked it up, opened it, and put it inside your pocket while I was kneeling on my own floor trying to stop your man from bleeding." Rafael Santoro looked at her for a very long time. Both hands hung at his sides, one gloved, one bare. He could have lied. He could have said he was protecting her, that he was saving her life. And both things were true, and Maeve knew they were true, and perhaps she would have accepted them, but he didn't say that. "Yes," he said. "I took it." Those words were the reason Maeve Donnelly stepped into the black car the following morning, and it would take her months to understand why. He hadn't lied to her. During the previous 18 months, many men had lied to her kindly. Brody had lied because he loved her. Kurt had lied because he enjoyed the game. And an entire hospital system had lied through red notices bearing someone's signature. Rafael Santoro had stood inside her apartment at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Yes, I took it," without adding a single word in his own defense. 6 hours later, she sat in the study of the Garden District mansion, still wearing the wrinkled nursing scrubs from the previous day's shift, listening as he told her that people would discover where the memory card had been hidden, and once they did, her second-floor apartment in Mid-City would be the first place they came, and its front door had already been kicked apart the night before. "I have a room in the East Wing," he said. "It has a private entrance. No one can get inside." Maeve looked out at the garden. She thought about the loose fourth stair. She thought about the dining table broken in half. She thought about her daughter eating fried eggs at Sister Agnes's house, knowing nothing. "All right," she said. Raphael nodded and reached for his telephone. "But I'm paying rent." His hand stopped. "What did you say?" "I'll stay in your house. I'm not foolish enough to refuse when I have a 4-year-old daughter." She sat straighter in the leather chair that cost more than her car. But I'm paying rent. $100 a month. On the first day of every month, by bank transfer, with a receipt. Gideon Price, standing in the doorway with one arm bandaged across his shoulder and a cup of coffee in his other hand, nearly choked. Rafael Santoro looked at her. Miss Donnelly, this house is worth $4 million. I know. $100. I know it sounds like a joke to you. Her voice wasn't loud. It simply didn't move. I know $100 means less to you than the tip you leave for the man who washes your car. But it isn't a joke to me. $100 is 4 overtime shifts. That is the amount I have. She paused. If I stay for free, then I'm your guest. And guests can be asked to leave at any time, and no one needs a guest's permission for anything. I was a guest in other people's homes from the age of 9 until I was 18, Mr. Santoro. I know exactly what that feels like. I won't do it again. The room fell silent. Gideon looked down into his coffee and didn't dare breathe. Rafael Santoro remained still for a long time, long enough for Maeve to begin believing she had ruined everything. Then he placed the telephone on the desk. Accepted. The first of every month. The first of every month, he said, with complete seriousness. I'll have someone prepare a lease. 3 days later, on Saturday afternoon, golden sunlight poured over the Garden District garden, and the scent of damp earth rose after the midday rain. Maeve stood on the steps holding a glass of iced tea, staring into the garden, unable to believe what she was seeing. Rafael Santoro was kneeling in the soil, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows, his left hand covered by a black leather glove, his right holding a small garden trowel. Beside him, also kneeling, also smeared with mud from her knees to her ankles, was a 4-year-old red-haired girl holding an orange sapling about 16 inches tall in both hands, as though it were something extraordinarily precious. Deeper, Noelle said. Deeper than this? Deeper. Its roots are long. Do you know how long its roots are? Of course. The little girl didn't blink. The roots are as long as the tree, but they're underground, so no one can see them. Rafael Santoro stopped with the trowel suspended in midair. Then he dug another 3/4 of an inch deeper. They lowered the tree into the hole. Noelle pushed the soil back with both hands, patting it firmly with great seriousness, and Rafael poured water around the roots, rather than directly against the trunk, while the little girl watched him with the concentration of an inspector. What is its name? Rafael asked. Does a tree have to have a name, Uncle? Trees in my garden do. Noelle considered that. She looked at the sapling, then at the larger orange tree 10 feet away, the one Rafael watered every afternoon. What is that tree called? It doesn't have a name. Then that one is Uncle Glove one, Noelle declared. And this one is Uncle Glove too, because it's his baby. On the steps, Maeve nearly dropped her iced tea. Noelle turned toward the left hand of the man sitting beside her, the hand covered in black leather beneath the 86-degree sunlight, and asked in the calm voice only children possessed, the voice that asked questions adults needed 10 years to gather the courage to speak. Why do you always wear a glove? Maeve opened her mouth to intervene. But Rafael had already answered, because I'm missing a finger. Which one? The little finger. Noelle nodded, accepting the information. She didn't ask why. She asked something else. Is it sad? Rafael Santoro sat motionless. On the rear veranda, Gideon Price, who had just begun lighting a cigarette, stopped. I don't think so, Rafael said. I think it went away to do another job. Noelle considered this for a very long time. Her head tilted to one side, her eyes narrowed at the newly planted tree. Then she nodded solemnly, like a professor who had just solved an equation. So you have 9 fingers, and 1 finger is at work. And Rafael Santoro laughed. Not a smirk. Not the slight curve of his lips that people called a smile because they had no other word for it. He threw his head back and laughed aloud, a sound breaking free from somewhere very deep and very old, and it echoed across the garden. On the veranda, Gideon Price lowered his cigarette. He had followed this man for 11 years. He had watched him give orders, watched him negotiate, watched him sit silently inside a room for 4 hours waiting for another person to speak first. He had never heard that sound. And on the steps, Maeve Donnelly stood with a glass of iced tea in her hand, watching her daughter, muddy to the elbows, laugh with the most powerful crime boss in Louisiana about a finger that had gone to work, and she felt something inside her chest turn through one very small degree, and she didn't know what to call it, and she feared it more than anything that had happened so far. That evening, After Noelle had been washed clean of the mud and fallen asleep with her stuffed elephant in the East Wing room with its own private entrance that no one could enter, Rafael Santoro sent someone to ask Maeve to come down to the study. She arrived wearing borrowed pajamas and a robe, her hair still damp, and stood in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest, because she had learned that when a powerful man invited a woman into a room at 10 o'clock at night, it was usually because he intended to take something from her. Rafael sat behind the large wooden desk, and on its surface between them lay a thick brown cardboard file, yellowed with age and tied with a length of coarse twine. He said nothing. He merely pushed it across the desk toward her with 2 fingers, exactly as he had pushed the O'Doherty ledgers toward her in the orange garden. "What is this?" Maeve asked. "Open it and you'll know." She didn't want to sit down, but she did. She untied the twine, opened the cover, and the first line she saw made the entire room tilt. Adoption record. Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services. Donnelly, Maeve Catherine. She had searched for this file for 18 years. She had called, submitted forms, driven to 3 different offices, and sat for hours in plastic chairs. And every time they had told her the same thing, in the same exhausted voice. That record was lost, Miss Donnelly. There was a flood in the basement archives in 2005. We're very sorry. Nothing remains. For 18 years, she had believed her past had been washed away by water, and this man had placed it on the desk without spending a cent. It had cost only 1 telephone call from someone no one dared allow the telephone to ring more than twice. Maeve turned the page. Her hands trembled. Everything was there. A house fire report dated one November evening when she was 9 years old. The address of a wooden house in St. Bernard Parish that she remembered only faintly through the smell of smoke. Her father's name, her mother's name, 2 dry lines confirming that neither of them had made it out of the house, and a third stating that the child, female, 9 years old, had been carried outside by a firefighter and had suffered second-degree burns to her left forearm. Maeve looked down at her left wrist, at the crescent-shaped scar she had hidden beneath her sleeves for 18 years, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where it had come from. She had always believed she had somehow injured herself. She hadn't. Someone had pulled her out. "Someone carried me out," she said, not entirely speaking to anyone. "I always thought." She didn't finish. She turned to the final page, and the final page wasn't an adoption document. It was another form, printed on hospital letterhead, and Maeve had seen 10,000 forms like it throughout her career, so she recognized it immediately. An insurance coverage denial, dated 3 weeks after the fire. Patient, female child, 9 years old, orphaned, no guardian, uninsured. Treatment, burn care, skin graft to the left forearm. Status, coverage denied. And at the bottom, inside the approval signature box, was handwriting she didn't recognize. A neat, abbreviated name written in blue ink. A. Vance. Maeve looked at the name and felt nothing. It meant nothing to her. A signature on an 18-year-old piece of paper, one of thousands some hospital official had signed during his life. She turned the page over to see whether anything else remained, then looked up, and she almost missed it. Had she raised her head half a second earlier, she would have missed it. But she looked up at precisely the right moment and saw Rafael Santoro's face. He was staring at the paper in her hands, and his expression was perfectly calm. Too calm. It was the kind of calm an emergency nurse learned to recognize, the face of someone who had just heard something and was using every ounce of strength to prevent his features from revealing it. It passed in an instant. He said nothing about the name, and Maeve, too overwhelmed by everything else, didn't ask. It was the detail she would remember much later, when it was already too late. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked. Raphael rose from behind the desk. He walked around it slowly and stopped a few steps away from her. "My mother died on the floor of the emergency department at St. Ambrose when I was 11 years old," he said. His voice was quiet and even, without the slightest trace of self-pity. "She bled for 3 hours in the corridor, not because they couldn't save her. Because she was the wife of a gangster and had no insurance, and no one in that building was willing to touch her until it was too late." Maeve looked up at him. The entire room was still. "The emergency department at St. Ambrose," she said. Then, even more quietly, "I work on that floor." For one long moment, neither of them spoke. They stood beneath the golden light of the study, 3 steps apart, and between them lay a yellowed file and a hospital that had taken something from both of them 23 years apart in the same corridor. The scar on her wrist, his four-fingered hand beneath the glove. The same building, the same silence that had abandoned them. Maeve couldn't remember who stepped forward first. Later, whenever she tried to recall it, she couldn't separate which of them had closed those 3 steps. But she remembered the kiss. It wasn't like the one in the alcove at the hotel. Not panic, not a shield. This time, she kept her eyes open for the first half-second and saw that his were open too. And then they both closed them, and his gloved hand settled against the back of her neck as gently as though he feared she might break. And this time, neither of them ran. That kiss happened 3 nights before the night everything broke apart, and during those 3 nights, Rafael Santoro didn't tell Maeve that his people had cracked the memory card. He allowed her to believe it was still a mystery. He allowed her to sleep in the room in the East Wing, to take Noelle into the garden every afternoon to water Uncle Glove too, to believe she was living inside a safe pause. Meanwhile, in the basement, behind 3 doors and a layer of concrete, his people copied, decoded, and listened to all 34 files on that card. On the 3rd night, Gideon called him downstairs. The windowless basement, a metal table, a screen, a pair of speakers. Gideon stood beside the table, his right arm still suspended in a cloth sling across his shoulder, and there was something on his face Raphael had never seen in that man during 11 years. Hesitation. "You need to hear this, boss," Gideon said. "But I should warn you, it isn't what we thought." Raphael poured himself a glass of whiskey from the decanter on the shelf and sat down. "Go ahead. There's nothing on the card about the O'Doherty family. No ledgers, no accounts, no names from the organization. Her husband, Brody Vaughn, wasn't laundering money. He was an audio engineer, remember? He worked for a recording studio before he lost his job." Gideon touched the screen with his uninjured hand. 34 audio files. He wasn't recording the criminal families. He recorded private meetings of the St. Ambrose Hospital Board. For 2 years before he died. Raphael didn't move. "It's a fraudulent insurance payment operation, not petty theft. They created phantom patients, phantom treatments, even phantom deaths, then collected money from state insurance programs and charitable funds. They've been doing it for 20 years. The amount mentioned in these files runs into 8 figures, and that is only the portion Brody managed to record." Gideon paused. "The O'Doherty family is involved, but they're at the bottom. They were hired to frighten anyone who started asking questions. Connor O'Doherty isn't the man behind this, boss. He's an enforcer. And Brody Vaughn discovered who was behind it, so he made the recordings to protect himself, then hid them in the only place no one would ever think to look, around his wife's neck." Raphael set his whiskey on the table. "The last file," he said. "Play it." Gideon looked at him for 1 second, then pressed the button. There was the static of a recording device hidden inside a pocket, the scrape of chairs, the touch of glasses, the sound of a large room filled with people. Then a voice began speaking. A deep, calm, unhurried male voice. The voice of someone accustomed to an entire room falling silent whenever he spoke. The voice discussed numbers. It spoke about a certain person who had begun asking questions and needed to be reminded. It said everything would remain under control as long as no one found the documents. And Rafael Santoro, who had sat motionless throughout the entire recording, slowly tightened his hand around the glass. He knew that voice. He had known it for 23 years. The glass shattered in his hand. Whiskey ran down, and with it came a thin line of blood from his palm, dripping onto the dark red Persian carpet, and against that red, no one could see it fall. Gideon stepped forward half a pace. "Boss!" Raphael didn't move, and this was what Gideon would never forget. His employer wasn't surprised. A surprised man flinched, asked who it was, needed to hear the recording again. Rafael Santoro only sat there, staring at the shards of glass inside his bleeding palm, and on his face was the expression of a man who had just received something he had been waiting for a very, very long time. He had known the name Alistair Vance since he was 11 years old. He had known exactly who had signed the paper that sent his mother into the corridor. And for 23 years, he had grown, built an empire, bought the port of New Orleans, bought 3 federal judges, bought a position inside the police department and half the members of the city council, and he had never, not once, managed to touch Alistair Vance. The man was clean on every document, 3 layers of attorneys, a seat on the city council, a name attached to pediatric wings and fundraising galas with gold lettering. Raphael could have killed him at any moment during those 23 years, and he hadn't, because killing Vance would have been only 1 death, 1 second, and his mother had bled for 3 hours. He wanted something money couldn't buy, a thread tying that name to its crimes where everyone could see it, and he had never possessed one. Until tonight. 23 years, Raphael said, very quietly, almost to himself. It was here all along, inside a $40 pendant, around the neck of a nurse, and she carried it into that building every day without knowing. He began to laugh. It was a very quiet sound, and Gideon Price, who had stood beside this man for 11 years and only 3 days earlier had heard him laugh with joy in the garden beside a child, stepped back half a pace without realizing he had moved. "Boss," Gideon said. "Is she your weakness?" Rafael Santoro looked up, the shards of glass still inside his hand, blood still dripping onto the carpet. "No," he said. "She isn't my weakness, Gideon. She is my bill, and I have waited 23 years for someone to deliver it to me." He stood, wrapped a cloth around his bleeding palm, and walked toward the stairs. Gideon remained alone in the basement, with the recording silenced, and a question he didn't want to ask. "Are you going to tell her?" Raphael stopped on the first stair. He didn't turn around. He reached back and lowered the laptop screen, and half the room disappeared into darkness. "After he is dead," he said. Then he walked upstairs, and Gideon Price stood there in the dark with the unmistakable feeling, though he didn't speak it aloud, that his employer had just made his first mistake in 11 years. That same night, 2.5 miles from the Garden District mansion, Kurt Halloran sat inside an old car in the darkest corner of the St. Ambrose Hospital parking lot, and Rafael Santoro had been wrong. Starving dogs didn't return to their former masters. Rafael had said those words with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been hungry, and that was precisely what he failed to understand. An animal that had been kicked enough times didn't crawl back to the foot that had kicked it. It went searching for another hand. Any hand at all, as long as that hand held food. Kurt had driven aimlessly for 2 days since the night he crawled down those 11 steps. A doctor in the Irish Channel had wrapped his wrist in a splint and bandages, and every time Kurt shifted gears, pain shot through it to remind him. But the pain in his wrist wasn't what kept him awake. What kept him awake was the sentence spoken by the man in the glove, the sentence that had lodged inside him like a hook. People don't pity a failure. Kurt knew it was true. That was why he couldn't allow it to become the truth about him. He pulled from his wallet a scrap of paper softened by 3 years of being folded inside it. A string of numbers had been written on the paper in pencil, faded so badly that he had to tilt it toward the parking lot light to read. 3 years earlier, someone inside the O'Doherty family, a man long since dead, had given him that number and said, "Keep it. Never use it unless you're about to die. This belongs to the man at the very top." Kurt had never dared dial it. People didn't call the man at the top, but he was drowning. And a drowning man reached for anything. He entered the number. The telephone rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, calm and unhurried, the voice of an older man who had just set down a glass of wine to take the call. "Yes? Dr. Vance." Kurt heard the dryness in his own voice. "You don't know me. My name is Halloran. I work for O'Doherty. Or I did." Silence on the other end. Not confused silence. The silence of a man waiting to hear a reason not to end the call. "I know what you've been searching for over the last 18 months, Kurt said quickly, the words stumbling over one another. "The thing you had the old man assigned someone to watch outside the nurse's door. It wasn't inside her apartment. I searched the place. There was nothing there. It was hanging around her neck, inside the pendant she's worn for 3 years, beneath her clothes, and no one thought of it." Kurt swallowed. "And it isn't around her neck anymore. It's in Rafael Santoro's hands now." The other end remained silent for a very long time. Kurt heard something, perhaps fingers tapping slowly and evenly against wood. When Alistair Vance spoke again, his voice hadn't changed, still gentle, still unhurried. That chilled Kurt more deeply than shouting would have. This was the voice of a man who had signed thousands of denial forms in his lifetime, each one representing someone who wouldn't be saved, signing them all with the same neat stroke before going home to dinner. "Mr. Halloran." "Yes." "Do you know anyone who handles cleanup?" Kurt blinked. "You mean—" "I don't mean anything like the O'Dohertys. The intimidation, the broken wrists, the men standing outside doors. Amateur work." There was the sound of a wine glass being lifted and set down again. "I'm asking whether you know professionals. People who enter, finish the work, and leave without a single name behind." Kurt sat motionless in the darkness of the car, and he understood that he had just stepped through a door with no way back, and he also understood that he no longer had any choice because, behind him, There was only a bar full of men who would soon laugh in his face. "I know a few people," he said. "Then call them." The line went dead. Kurt Halloran sat alone in the car, his splinted wrist throbbing with every beat of his heart, while across the city, inside a warm study, Rafael Santoro was wrapping a fresh bandage around the palm cut by broken glass and believing he had designed a perfect lesson in humiliation. The architect always calculated 6 moves ahead, but he had built that calculation around a man he believed he understood, and he had spared the one person he should never have spared. And through that very act of measured mercy, he had drawn the blueprint for his own destruction. Rafael Santoro didn't tell Maeve about the 34 audio files, but he did something else. 2 nights later, he took her to dinner. Verene stood on a quiet corner of the French Quarter behind an unmarked wooden door, and the private dining room on the 2nd floor contained only one table. Maeve wore the wine-colored dress she had found hanging inside the wardrobe in the East Wing room. Exactly her size. Exactly the shade she would have chosen if her life had ever allowed her to choose. She stood before the mirror for half an hour before going downstairs. And it wasn't the dress that made her stop. It was her face in the glass. For the first time in her life, Maeve Donnelly looked into a mirror and saw a beautiful woman, and she knew it, and she didn't turn away. At the restaurant, Raphael pulled out her chair. Candles, wine, a man looking at her as though she were the only real thing in the room. Maeve noticed one small detail. Gideon wasn't with them. For the past 3 weeks, Gideon Price had been everywhere Raphael went, standing by the door, on the veranda, at the top of the stairs, like a shadow that drank coffee. Tonight, he wasn't there. "Where is Gideon?" she asked. "At home. His shoulder needs time to heal." Raphael poured her wine. "I ordered him to rest." Maeve nodded, and thought nothing more of it. She would remember that answer 30 seconds later, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. They ate, they talked, and that was the strangest part, because Maeve realized she was laughing, telling him about Sister Agnes, about the elephant-shaped nightlight, about an 80-year-old patient who proposed to her every time he was admitted to the hospital. Then, halfway through the main course, she set down her fork and asked the question that had been resting inside her chest for 3 weeks. "What happens next?" Raphael looked up. "I live in your house. I water your trees with my daughter. I wear dresses from your wardrobe." She looked directly at him. "Are you going to keep me locked away, Raphael? Is that what this is? Am I your pet, kept inside a beautiful house, fed well, and waiting there whenever you want me?" Rafael Santoro set down his wineglass, and the warm charm he had worn throughout the evening vanished from his face, replaced by something far sharper and more exposed, something Maeve had never seen before. "If you want to leave," he said, his voice quiet and clear, "right now, tonight, I will call a car. I will take you and your daughter anywhere in this country. I will open an account containing $15 million in your name, and you will never have to work another night shift, and you will never see my face again. I mean every word. All you have to do is stand up." Maeve couldn't speak. "But if you stay," Raphael continued, "then listen carefully. Because I will say this only once. You will not stay as a pet. You will not stay as a guest. You will stay as my equal, as the lady of my house. Everything I possess will be yours. Every door that opens for me will open for you. And no one in this city, will ever be permitted to look down on you again." Maeve looked at him through the candlelight, and she felt tears rising into her eyes, and she hated them, and she refused to blink so they wouldn't fall. She opened her mouth. The dining room door burst inward. Later, when people asked what had happened, Maeve remembered only fragments. She remembered Raphael rising before the door even struck the wall, as though some part of him had been waiting for this throughout the evening. She remembered his hand seizing the edge of the oak table and overturning it between her and the doorway in the same motion, then the full weight of his body coming down over her, pressing her against the wooden floor, covering her completely with himself. She remembered the noise. 40 seconds. Glass shattered into rain. Plaster fell from the ceiling like filthy snow, turning the shoulders of Raphael's black jacket white. Her ears filled with a solid ringing, and inside that ringing she heard her own heart and the breathing of the man shielding her, steady and controlled. Even then silence. A thick, white silence, with the smell of copper and sulfur hanging in the air. Rafael Santoro lifted himself from her. His hands moved rapidly over her body, her shoulders, arms, ribs, searching, trembling, and for the first time in this entire story, his face had lost all control. Those amber eyes were wide with genuine panic, with something deeply and unmistakably human. "Say something," he said. His voice broke. "Maeve, say something." "I'm all right," she breathed. "I'm all right. I'm not hurt." The outer door slammed open, and Gideon Price rushed inside, one arm still in its sling, a gun in his other hand. Exactly 30 seconds too late, 30 seconds when he should have been inside that room, if Raphael hadn't ordered him to remain at home. His eyes swept across the ruined room, and Maeve watched him do something only a man like him could do. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at his employer. He looked at the floor. He studied the shell casings scattered across the wood. He examined the position of the door, the angle of fire, the way the attackers had entered and the way they had withdrawn. "Boss." Gideon's voice was slow and steady, and there was something inside it that turned Maeve's blood cold. These weren't Irishmen. Raphael, still kneeling on the floor beside Maeve, raised his head. Wrong ammunition. Wrong formation. The withdrawal was too clean. O'Doherty doesn't have anyone capable of this. Gideon bent down, picked up a shell casing, and turned it beneath the light that remained. These men were mercenaries, boss. Professionals. Someone hired them. And Raphael Santoro, the man who calculated 6 moves ahead, the man who always knew who sat on the opposite side of every board, knelt amid the wreckage beside the woman he had just shielded with his body, and for the first time in 23 years, he didn't know who had just tried to kill him. Grip. Raphael's men flooded into the building in less than 2 minutes, and while they helped Maeve to her feet and draped a coat over her shoulders, Gideon Price disappeared down the stairs with 2 other men, and when he returned, he didn't return alone. He dragged a human figure into the middle of the ruined dining room and dropped him onto the wooden floor covered in broken glass. Kurt Halloran, bruised, missing 1 shoe, 1 cheek split open, and the splint around his wrist broken in half. "Caught him in the parking lot across the street," Gideon said, sitting inside an old car, waiting. He looked down at Kurt with nothing in his eyes. He was waiting to see how it ended. Kurt Halloran began talking the moment he hit the floor, the words pouring out of him like water from a shattered pitcher. "It wasn't me, I swear. I didn't hire anyone. I only made the call. I only gave them the name. I didn't know they would do it tonight. I swear on my mother's grave." He crawled backward until his spine struck the leg of an overturned chair. "It was Vance. Dr. Alistair Vance. He is on the hospital board. He is the man at the top. He owns all of it. O'Doherty only works for him. That nurse's husband recorded him, and that is why he needed the memory card. I called him. I told him the card was in your hands, and he asked whether I knew anyone who handled cleanup." He gasped for breath. "I sold him to you. Do you hear me? I just gave you everything. Spare me." 4 seconds. That was all the time Kurt Halloran needed to betray the man he had just called. Raphael Santoro drew the gun from inside his jacket. He didn't hurry. He released the safety with his thumb, a small, dry click inside the silent room, then stepped forward and placed the barrel against Kurt Halloran's forehead, directly between his eyebrows. "You touched what belongs to me," he said. His voice was no louder than a breath. That was the most frightening part, the complete absence of emotion, and everyone in the room knew the finger on the trigger was about to tighten. "Raphael, wait." The entire room froze. Every man there turned his head, and in 11 years, no one in the world, had ever interrupted the architect in the middle of an execution. Gideon Price held his breath. Raphael didn't lower the gun, but he turned his head, and he looked at her. Maeve Donnelly stepped past the overturned oak table, broken glass grinding beneath her heels, the wine-colored dress sweeping through the white plaster scattered across the floor. She walked forward and stood looking down at Kurt Halloran, and Kurt looked up at her, with eyes suddenly bright with hope, because, of everyone in that room, she was the only person who had endured him without striking back, and inside his shattered mind, that restraint meant weakness, and weak people begged for mercy. 18 months, Maeve said. Her voice didn't tremble. "Every Friday night at 9 o'clock, you arrived so precisely that I could have set my clock by you. You turned fear into a schedule, Kurt. You made me arrange my entire life around you. You made me believe I deserved it, that this was what my life was meant to give me, that someone like me deserved nothing more than to stand behind a door locked twice, waiting for the sound of your shoes." She paused. Kurt stared up at her, trembling. "But look at you," she spoke very quietly. "Look at you lying on the floor, Kurt. You were never frightening. For 18 months, I believed you were a monster, and you were only a camera someone placed outside my door to record me. And now it is broken, and it is lying on the floor crying." Then she turned toward Raphael. She looked at the gun in his hand. She looked at the barrel pressed against a man's forehead. She looked at the plaster and shattered glass and shell casings, at the entire dark, bloody, powerful world this man ruled, the world an orphaned emergency nurse should have run from. And Maeve understood, with cold and absolute clarity, the truth that had been growing inside her for 3 weeks. She wasn't afraid of his darkness. She wasn't afraid because she had finally understood what it existed to do. He had overturned the table and covered her with his body without hesitating for even half a second. His darkness wasn't directed at her. It rose around her like a wall so the light inside couldn't be blown out. She reached forward. She placed 2 fingers against the barrel of the gun and gently, without the slightest trace of fear, pushed it toward the floor. "Don't kill him here," she said. "He isn't worth staining this dress." Raphael Santoro stopped breathing. For one long moment, he only looked at her, the gun hanging loosely in his hand beneath the pressure of her 2 fingers, and then a smile spread across his face, slowly, and it was so full of pride that it was almost painful to witness. He looked at her as though she had just placed the entire world in his palm, as though for 23 years he had been waiting for this exact woman to walk through broken glass and tell him to lower his gun. "Gideon," he said, his eyes never leaving Maeve. "Take Mr. Halloran to the harbor. Help him understand the meaning of debt." 2 days after the night at Vereen, the Garden District house returned to a strange kind of quiet, the quiet of a place where everyone was waiting for something no one dared name. And within that silence, one evening, Noelle Donnelly walked barefoot into the kitchen, holding her gray stuffed elephant against her chest with both hands, her face as grave as though she were carrying a patient into an operating room. "Brett is hurt." Raphael Santoro was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of documents, and he set both aside. "Where is she hurt?" "Her ear." The little girl placed the elephant on the table and pointed to the place where the stitching along one cloth ear had come loose, opening a tear that revealed the white stuffing inside. "We were playing on the stairs. Then her ear tore. She didn't cry, but I know it hurts." Raphael looked at the elephant, then at the child. "Do I need to sew it back together?" "Do you know how to sew?" "I've sewn a few things." He didn't say what those things had been. He stood, searched through the drawers until he found a sewing box no one in the house remembered buying, then sat beneath the yellow light and began repairing a stuffed elephant with his gloved left hand, which had 4 fingers, while his right hand held the needle. It took 40 minutes. The most powerful crime boss in Louisiana, the man who controlled the port of New Orleans, and 3 federal judges, the man who could make someone disappear from the face of the earth with a single telephone call, sat sewing the ear of a stuffed elephant, and he was remarkably clumsy at it. The needle slipped from his fingers twice. The thread tangled once, and he had to undo it and begin again. And throughout those 40 minutes, Noelle stood beside his elbow, directing every stitch with the severity of a surgeon supervising an intern. "That stitch is too close, farther apart. No, now it's too far, they have to be even." At last, he tied the final knot and cut the thread, then handed the elephant back to the child, and they both examined it. The stitching was crooked. It wasn't straight. One end sat higher than the other, and one ear was now slightly more pointed than its mate. Noelle lifted the elephant, turned it beneath the light, and studied it from every angle with her eyebrows drawn together. Raphael waited, and Maeve, standing in the kitchen doorway where neither of them had noticed her, waited too, and she knew this man exactly. She knew he couldn't tolerate a crooked painting. She had watched him straighten a frame inside the hotel alcove while 6 guns were aimed at her. She knew he would look at that uneven seam and his hands would ache to tear it apart and redo it properly. "It's prettier than before," Noelle declared. She hugged the elephant to her chest. "Now Bread has a special ear. No one else has an ear like this." And Raphael Santoro looked at the crooked stitches he had placed in the elephant's ear, the stitches that every cell in his body wanted to remove and redo, and he didn't touch them. He left them exactly as they were. He only nodded with complete seriousness and said, "Yes, no one else has an ear like that." In the doorway, Maeve Donnelly placed one hand against the frame to steady herself because she had just learned something she had spent 3 weeks trying not to know. She had fallen in love with this man, not because of the house, not because of the safety, not because of the way he had covered her with his body at Vereen, because he had left a crooked seam untouched for a child who was 4 years old. Then Noelle ran off to bed with her elephant, and Raphael rose to wash his coffee cup, and Maeve entered the kitchen to help him put away the needle and thread, and she saw his laptop open at the far end of the table, its screen still glowing. An audio software window. a file open and paused halfway through, and a date displayed beneath the sound waves. She hadn't intended to listen. She had only meant to close it for him. But a pair of headphones lay beside the keyboard, and her finger touched the spacebar before she could think, and she lifted one side of the headphones to her ear, and she listened. And Maeve Donnelly's entire world tilted and shattered. 3 truths fell upon her at once, and she couldn't catch any of them. The first truth was that this was one of the recordings from the memory card, already decrypted, already heard, 3 days earlier. Raphael had known everything on that card for 3 days, and he had sat sewing stuffed elephants and placing dresses in her wardrobe without saying a word. The second truth came from the voice inside the recording, another man's voice, exhausted and afraid, and it took Maeve 3 seconds to realize it was Brody, her Brody. And Brody hadn't been laundering money, hadn't betrayed her to a criminal organization, hadn't been the selfish man she had hated for 18 months. Brody had been trying to escape. A network had tightened around their family through medical debts she had never known existed, and he had made the recordings to save himself, to save her and their daughter. And he had been driven into a corner, and he had died on that stretch of highway while trying to do the right thing in the most desperate and misguided way a person could choose. She had hated a dead man who had died trying to save her. And the third truth was the other voice, the voice of the man on the opposite side, deep and gentle and unhurried, the voice that had made Raphael crush a glass in his hand when he heard it. Maeve recognized it. She had heard it 3 years earlier when it told her she had been hired. She had seen its owner at the fundraising gala, turning his face away when she nodded in greeting, and now she knew she had seen his handwriting once before, on an insurance denial form dated when she was 9 years old. Alistair Vance. Maeve turned around. Raphael Santoro stood in the kitchen doorway, the needle and spool of thread still in his hands. "You knew," she said. "For 3 days." "Yes. When were you going to tell me?" He didn't answer immediately, and that silence was already the answer before he finally spoke. After he was dead. Maeve stood perfectly still. She looked down at the headphones in her hand, then placed them carefully on the table beside the glowing laptop. "Do you remember the night you took the necklace from my neck? Inside my home, while I was kneeling on the floor trying to stop Gideon from bleeding?" Her voice wasn't loud. "I told myself it was urgent. I thought you didn't have time to ask. I invented an excuse for you because I wanted to trust you." She raised her eyes to his. "But you didn't forget to ask me, Raphael. You chose not to, just as you did now." She stepped past him and walked out through the kitchen door. "So you're only another man deciding for me. You simply make it look more beautiful than the others did." And she left. Raphael Santoro remained alone beneath the yellow kitchen light, the needle used to sew the elephant still held in his 4-fingered hand. And for the first time in 23 years, the architect had no blueprint for what had just happened. Maeve left the Garden District house that night and returned to her second-floor apartment with its newly replaced door, and she reported for the night shift the following evening as though everything were normal because she didn't know how to do anything except go to work. She didn't know that by stepping beyond the wall Raphael had built around her, she had stepped outside the only protection she had left. And she didn't know one more thing, something Raphael himself had only just pieced together while sitting alone in the basement with 34 audio files and the name of someone inside his own family. Enzo Santoro, his cousin, had sold her schedule to Vance, not for money. Enzo's little daughter lay inside a hospital where only the St. Ambrose board could approve the treatment that would save her life. And Vance had seized that weakness and squeezed. The same hook that had caught Brody, the same hook that had caught Connor O'Doherty 3 years earlier, when the old man's granddaughter needed something only that board could authorize. That was when Raphael understood the full shape of what had happened, and it chilled him in a way no gun ever had. Connor O'Doherty had never been the enemy. The 18 months spent watching Maeve's door, forbidding Kurt to take even 1 cent, forbidding him to touch her, ordering him only to stand there and count, had never been about hunting her. It had been about keeping her alive. As long as Vance wasn't certain she possessed the card, she was worth more alive. The day Vance knew for certain, she would be dead within a week. Connor had locked her inside a cage built from fear so no bullet could reach her. He had refused Raphael's $1 million not out of pride, but because accepting that money would mean closing the cage and delivering her outside it. "The girl isn't for sale," the old man had said, and he had been telling the truth in a way no one in that room had understood. No one in this entire story was truly evil. They were only people caught by a system that found the most painful place inside each of them, the place bearing the name of a child, a granddaughter, a wife, and squeezed until they would do anything. Raphael understood that at 11 o'clock that night. At 11:20, Gideon's telephone rang. The guard at the hospital reported that Maeve had finished her shift at 11 but had never reached the parking lot. A vehicle had collected her at the employee entrance. It wasn't one of theirs. The old warehouse at Algiers Point was empty and abandoned, standing at the edge of the river, and rain was falling outside. The Mississippi River was black as oil, swollen in the darkness, licking at rotting wooden pilings. They brought Maeve there directly from her shift, still wearing her blue scrubs, without even having time to remove her nitrile examination gloves, the waist pouch at her hip still filled with the tools of an emergency nurse who had just completed 12 hours of work. Alistair Vance stood waiting beneath a single light, his hands clasped behind his back, wearing a long coat, 60 years old, and as calm as though he were waiting for a board meeting. "Miss Donnelly," he said, "I signed the papers that hired you. Did you know that? 3 years ago, my signature appears on many documents concerning you." He stepped closer. "Your husband took something from me. You wore it for 3 years. I only need to know whether any copies remain, and then you may go home." He was lying, and Maeve knew he was lying because she had watched too many faces lie from beside hospital beds. He took another step and reached toward her, and that was his mistake because he believed he was approaching an invisible nurse who carried trays. But Maeve Donnelly understood the human body better than anyone inside that warehouse. She knew exactly where a 60-year-old heart rested, how it beat, and what could make its rhythm falter. Her gloved hand was already inside her medical pouch before he reached her, and what she pulled out and used wasn't meant to kill, only enough to make an aging heart, already strained by tension, stumble once, then stumble again. And Alistair Vance released a startled grunt before collapsing onto the wet concrete with one hand clutching his chest. Outside, at that same moment, gunfire erupted. The warehouse door tore free from its hinges. Raphael Santoro and Gideon Price rushed inside through rain driven backward by the wind, and what Raphael saw when the light swept across the room stopped him in the middle of a step. Maeve was kneeling on the wet concrete, bent over Alistair Vance. Her two gloved hands were stacked over the center of the chest of the man who had left Raphael's mother bleeding on a corridor floor. The man who had denied treatment for Maeve's burns when she was 9 years old. The enemy Raphael had carried throughout his life. And she was performing chest compressions, steady, precise, keeping him alive. "Maeve." Raphael's voice was scarcely a sound, the gun raised in his hand. "Take your hands off him." She didn't look up. She counted the rhythm inside her head, her hands never stopping, and she spoke in the calm voice she used at 4 o'clock in the morning inside the emergency department when everything was falling apart. "I'm not saving him. Press, press, press. I'm saving myself from becoming him." Raphael Santoro stood in the rain with his gun aimed at the man he had waited 23 years to kill, and he watched the woman he loved kneeling on the floor, keeping that man alive with her own hands. At Vereen, she had taught him that she could stop his hand. That night, inside the warehouse, she taught him something greater. He lowered the gun. Vance lived. That was the punishment. The ambulance arrived and carried him away, still breathing. And the following morning, all 34 audio files were sent out at the same time to the regional FBI office, 3 major newspapers, and the state medical board. Alistair Vance didn't die inside a dark warehouse beside the river, quickly and cleanly, a death people would forget. He lost everything publicly, slowly, layer by layer, over many years, before the same people who had once risen to applaud when he stepped onto a stage to accept humanitarian awards. Gideon Price stood beside Raphael in the rain and watched the ambulance pull away. "You didn't kill him, boss." "No," Raphael Santoro said, his eyes still following the woman removing the rain-soaked gloves from her hands. "I designed him." 3 weeks later, St. Ambrose Hospital had a new pediatric wing. It was on the 4th floor, bright and warm, with medical-grade air purifiers in every room and a large window overlooking the old oak trees draped in moss. There was no donor's name on the wall, no bronze plaque, no line of gold lettering, but everyone who worked at St. Ambrose knew who had paid for it, and no one said the name aloud, because some names were understood to belong inside the chest rather than carved into a wall. It was in the corridor of that new pediatric wing that Sister Agnes Bellwether met Raphael Santoro for the first time. The 61-year-old woman stood in the middle of the passage, small in her head nurse's uniform, and looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful man in Louisiana as though he were an intern who had arrived late. She asked whether he attended church. Raphael said no. She told him he should start. And Raphael Santoro, who had pressed a gun barrel against a man's forehead 3 weeks earlier without changing expression, bowed his head and said, "Yes, sister." That same week, a box of tea arrived at the Garden District mansion. There was no card, no return address, only a stamp from a small bar in the Irish Channel that Raphael recognized immediately. He said nothing. He simply boiled water, prepared the tea exactly as the old man had prepared it for Gideon, then sat alone in the study and drank it in silence for a very long time. And that was the only expression of gratitude those two men would ever exchange. Maeve kept her job. That was the first thing they argued about after everything settled. Raphael wanted her to quit, wanted her never to work another night shift, and he had every reasonable argument in the world. She refused. She told him that her steady hands and clear mind at 4 o'clock in the morning were the only things in this world she had always known for certain about herself, that she wasn't a woman meant to be placed inside a beautiful house, that she was a nurse, and that something inside her would slowly die if that was taken away. And Raphael Santoro, instead of persuading her, instead of buying her compliance, instead of designing a reason for her to change her mind, only nodded and said, "All right." That was the final proof. The proof his words at Vereen hadn't been enough to provide, that when he said equal, he had meant it. But before she forgave him, Maeve established one rule. She sat across from him in the study, the same room where 3 weeks earlier he had given her the file she had searched for over 18 years. And she spoke very quietly and very clearly. "I will forgive you for hiding the truth from me. But there is one rule, Raphael, and it can never be broken. You will never again decide what is best for me." She paused, and there was something very old and deeply tired inside her voice. "No one has ever asked what I wanted. Not my parents, because they died before I was old enough to be asked. Not the foster care system that moved me through 9 homes. Not Brody, who decided to carry everything alone and then let the weight fall onto me. Not Connor, who locked me inside a cage to save me without asking whether I wanted to be saved that way. Not you." She looked directly into his eyes. "You will be the first person who asks." Raphael Santoro sat motionless for a long time, long enough for Maeve to hear the clock inside the room. Then he said, "Accepted." That night, the Garden District garden glowed beneath a strand of small lights. Noelle had insisted they hang between the 2 orange trees. The child had played all afternoon and was now asleep in a wicker chair, holding the stuffed elephant with the crookedly sewn ear against her chest. And beside the chair stood a little orange sapling about 16 inches tall, named Uncle Glove 2, its new leaves just beginning to emerge after the rain. Maeve stood beneath the lights, and Raphael came to stand beside her. And there, beneath the warm golden glow, he did something Gideon Price would later swear he had never witnessed in 11 years. He raised his left hand and removed the black leather glove. Then he placed it on the table, not to put it on again. Ever. His bare 4-fingered hand rested beneath the lights, the old white scar of 23 years exposed, hidden no longer. Then Raphael Santoro knelt. For the first time in his life, he knelt before another human being without begging for his life, without pleading for mercy, without being forced to his knees. "I can't give you a normal life," he said. "I don't know what normal is. I've never had it. But I can promise you one thing, and I will keep that promise until the day I die. I will ask you, every day, about everything. I will be the first person who asks, and I will wait for your answer." And Maeve Donnelly, the orphan child pulled from a burning house, the widow who had spent 18 months hating the wrong dead man, the single mother who had paid for permission to exist, one shift at a time throughout her 27 years of life, bent down toward the man kneeling before her. "I don't need the whole city, Raphael," she said. "I don't need your kingdom, or $4 million, or the name all of New Orleans whispers. I only need one person who sees that I am real. Just one." With his bare 4-fingered hand, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose and kissed her beneath the string of lights. And when he lifted his head, those amber eyes looked at her exactly as they had from the first second inside the dark alcove, the way a person looked at something real. "You are La Donna of New Orleans now," he said quietly, "the lady of this city. Let them try to look down on you." She had once seized a stranger in a dark corridor to escape her own life. In return, that man had given her an entire kingdom, a name before which the whole city bowed, a wall raised around her so no wind could ever extinguish the light within. But of everything he gave her, Maeve Donnelly kept only one thing, and she held it for the rest of her life. A bare, 4-fingered hand, no longer hidden beneath a glove, woven tightly into hers, And if Maeve's journey from an exhausted night shift nurse, invisible among 300 people, to LaDonna of New Orleans made you hold your breath even once along the way, please press the like button so we know you traveled the entire road beside her. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. And share this story with anyone who loves dark romance, so every day you can hear more compelling stories told completely from beginning to end. How did Maeve and Raphael's story make you feel? And what do you think about people who were crushed by a system at the most painful places inside them, and still fought to preserve their goodness? We would truly love to hear the feelings deep within your heart, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts, because every word you write gives us another reason to keep telling these stories. And one final question for you. If you were in Maeve's place, would you dare choose the architect? Thank you for listening until the very last words. We wish you, wherever you are watching this video, abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.